I'd just like to give you a bit of background for our debate. We can look at physiology and elements that can have an impact on these problems. There are three elements. You've got a problem of friction, which is the movement of the probe in the larynx, which can provide the basis for inflammation. Then there are two aspects to pressure. There is pressure from the balloon, even though the standard of care is now to reduce the pressure in the balloon, and I think most of the paramedical teams have done that. But there's also a question about the curve of the tube of the probe, and we can't do much about that. And there's still a pathophysiological problem here, which can cause laryngeal edema. Very briefly, you have three phases. You have a very early edema, and then even though you can get obvious variations depending on the studies, and there aren't all that many studies on this stage, you get ulceration, which can be more or less substantial depending on the state of the mucous membranes and the use of vasopressor drugs. And in the more serious cases, you have damage to the cartilage. If we look at the issue which interests us today, which is laryngeal edema, this usually appears immediately after extubation, although there are some studies which show a range from a few hours to a few days. So this is a question of whether you can really attribute it to the intubation, whether the edema is related to perfusion and inflammation. So there is a great variability depending on the study, and so this is why it's difficult to have a definition, because in most cases you have a clinical definition, even though sometimes you do have laryngoscopic or fibroscopic examination to have a better assessment, a more reliable assessment. The frequency, the prevalence is 2 to 22%, but it's a problem because there can be a life-threatening condition, and there may be a need for reintubation, which can bring its own morbidity or mortality risks. So usually for laryngeal edema, there are two stages. The minor stage, which is stretto, and you've got phonic anomalies, and then the major stage, which is the most meaningful one in a clinical situation, that is the need to reintubate the patient. The question I've been asked to look at today is because there's not much in the literature on this, and you can read virtually everything and see what see whether we should or should not give corticosteroids to prevent post-extubation laryngeal edema. There are some animal studies which are encouraging, been going back some 40 years now, covering the dual aspect, inflammation, ischemia, reperfusion, and also the rationale of the anti-inflammatory effect of corticosteroids to justify the use thereof. The first studies some 30 or more years ago, you've no doubt seen them, and I suggest we just go through them very quickly. The first one was published in the medical press in 1987. Nearly 300 patients were ventilated for more than 4 days, and they were given methylprednisolone, 1 milligram per kilo, or 80 milligrams, and it was 30 minutes before extubation. There was a laryngoscopic examination of patients suffering from dyspnea, and the dyspnea was not a significant difference between the two groups. At the time, it was not a very high incidence of dyspnea, and this may seem a bit surprising because it was really very, very low. Then there are a number of pediatric studies. Very briefly, This was looking at a different group. There were some 60 children with ventilation over 48 hours. They were given dexamethasone. It was 0.25 milligrams per kilo. And once again, it was just before extubation, 30 minutes before extubation. There was a clinical diagnosis. And as you can see, the rate of edema is clearly higher than in the previous study. But it was not significant, and there was no difference between the placebo group and the actual drug group, or for the reintubation. Now, the third study is another pediatric study. We have a similar, you could say it's a similar treatment, although it was a slightly higher dose, but what's a clear change here, and this was going to drive following clinical trials, is that this was done earlier. It was some 6 to 12 hours before extubation. Okay, the results here were also negative, but there was something which did occur. There was a slight advantage compared to the previous studies. And then there's the major study, which was done by Darman and published in Anesthesiology, 700 consecutive adults, and there was ranking according to the period of ventilation, less than or more than 36 hours. And they came back to an earlier design with 8 milligrams of dexamethasone 1 hour before extubation. And again, there was clinical diagnosis of edema, and the rationale was that it was post-extubation laryngoscopic or fibroscopic examination were difficult to set up and were certainly dubious from an ethical point of view. And there was no significance found between the two groups, no significant difference. So this cast doubt on the relevance of corticosteroid treatment as a preventive treatment. And then there's a final negative study. This was Ho's publication published in Intensive Care 4 years later. This is another compound, hydrocortisone, and this didn't make much sense because this has an anti-inflammatory effect which is not as effective as the previous ones, called dexamethasone or methylprednisolone. And it was a very early injection, 1 hour before extubation. And here you could see that the prevalence of dyspnea and stridor was quite high, but there was no significant difference between the two groups, except for one subgroup. There was a risk factor for which was sex-related, with an advantage for female patients given corticosteroids. And then in the same year, there was a positive finding in a pediatric study. It was with dexamethasone, 1 injection very early, 6 to 12 hours before extubation, and there was a significant difference with a reduction in laryngeal edema and a reduction in reintubation, particularly in the first few hours after extubation. So this was the first sign that was positive, and this revived interest in corticosteroid treatment as a means of preventing laryngeal edema. The French study that I was lucky enough to work on with at the time, we piloted, had a similar study to the Darman study, although there was no ranking according to the period of ventilation. These were patients who had more than 48 hours intubation, so they were really intensive care patients. There were multiple injections, 4 injections of 20 milligrams of methylprednisolone starting 12 hours before extubation, and the idea was that the earlier the corticosteroids were given, the greater the anti-inflammatory effect. And I'll leave you to assess the efficacy here. You can see the impact on the edema and also on reintubation. We'll see later in the meta-analyses and in some of the papers that there were high prevalence of stridor, and perhaps this was overestimated, but there was definitely a benefit for the rate of reintubation. And so this was in favor of methylprednisolone before extubation. And so here we had positive findings, and the scientific community was pleased to see that. And again in 2007 in Critical Care Med, there was a publication with a study on 3 arms. There was a placebo group, one with a single injection of 40 milligrams, and the third arm with 4 injections of 40 milligrams 24 hours before extubation. And there was a significant difference in the reduction in laryngeal edema. And this was clinical diagnosis here. And this introduced a new idea which emerged with this paper. And it was the cuff leak test, which was introduced as a means of raising awareness to high-risk patients. And then there's another publication which was on the same sort of approach. It was higher risk patients and assessed on the basis of the cuff leak test. They were given dexamethasone and not methylprednisolone, and it was a very early injection. It started 24 hours before extubation, and the benefit was on the impact of appearance of edema and the rate of reintubation. And these were 86 patients who were studied, and this is probably not enough to have any real assessment of the rate of reintubation. Well, you can say the literature has got a position there. Since 2007, there have only been positive results, whereas they were previously negative. Now, perhaps the question is not so meaningful because perhaps laryngeal edema are no longer a problem in 2015. Now, there are lots of studies, but it's difficult to get an idea of what's going on. Or there may be a lower prevalence, and this is a French team which published this paper 2 years ago. I'm not going to go through the design that was using the cuff leak test, but it was the number of laryngeal edema which is of interest here. And there was less than 10% prevalence in the population study. 104 patients, 7 had laryngeal edema, and 97 who didn't have laryngeal edema. So you can say there was a reduction in the incidence of laryngeal edema. However, there was another publication by the French team, and they did a systematic endoscopic examination of patients after extubation to see if there was edema. And there were laryngeal lesions. They were much greater because out of 136 or 140 patients, there were 36 who had no lesions and 100 who had damage to the larynx. And so there was a high level of laryngeal morbidity there, and I see that as continuing today. We saw Christian Brun-Brisson, and based on work by Michel Bros, and we did a bit of a survey. Over summer, we sent out questionnaires to our colleagues when we knew that we'd be speaking here, and I'd like to thank colleagues who answered this. It's just a preliminary survey, but it's always interesting as a point of discussion. 173 questionnaires were sent out, and we got 90 responses. Most agree that it's low prevalence, but when you look at the number of patients, you still have incidence of laryngeal edema which can get up to 10%. So it is a problem which is continuing. And when it occurs, everyone agrees that laryngeal edema is a major complication. Now we need to look at the corticosteroid treatment and the use thereof. There are 2 points to note here. One which is a positive point. Nearly everyone has limited the single dose before extubation, and it's usually done well upstream with sedation. But when you put them all together, you've got more than 90% not using it on a systematic basis. Less than 10% of departments use it as a systematic approach. And when people were asked why they didn't use it, they say there's not enough evidence in the literature. was 90%, and they say that the benefit-risk balance is not in favor of using it, which is food for thought. And then I asked questions about risk factors, which is not particularly relevant to the point we're looking at today. So you say, well, okay, there's not enough scientific evidence, and that it's not a good risk-benefit balance. But we saw with the two previous speakers that there are meta-analyses, and here we have one published in BMJ in 2008. At the top here, you have the incidence of laryngeal edema, just one study which is in favor of the placebo group, and then all the studies with findings in favor of corticosteroid treatment. And you get the benefit when you look at the need for reintubation. So there's a positive effect on the occurrence of laryngeal edema and on reintubation. And using a slightly different methodology, because they looked at the population groups, separating pediatric patients and adult patients, and looking at single doses versus multiple doses. And the finding of the Cochrane, there, published 5 years ago, was again quite clearly in favor of using corticosteroids. So you can say that it's clear in the literature. But what about the risk-benefit balance? Is a short. What are the side effects in the short-term treatment? There are a few major effects when it's low dose, and when you look at some 1,000 patients studied, even though you can, even when you look at the studies, there are 3 side effects, 3 out of 1,000 patients, and none of them was attributed to corticosteroids. So there's nothing in the literature which suggests that there's a greater risk than benefit. So then the question is, why? Why isn't it used? And I'd be happy to hear your comments. I would say that the main reason could be the programming of extubation and the whole patient organization. You have to do the cuff link test before, and perhaps you have to do weaning tests and schedule the extubation. That may be one of the limits. And perhaps in the trials, the literature overestimated the problem, and it's perhaps much less than we see in the literature. And perhaps there are some patients which get systematic cuff link tests and others only occasionally. And that, of course, intensivists don't like corticosteroids. That's true. And perhaps intensivists don't like protocol approaches. You never know. Well, we mentioned this with Laurent Brocha's presentation. Anyway, my conclusion is in line with the author of the Lancet editorial, who recommended routine use of corticosteroid treatment for all eligible patients.